Howdy folks! This is going to be an introductory lesson for using Blender. This kind of assumes you already have a background in 3D modeling of some sort, that you're coming from like Maya or other. I will mention a lot of Maya and like how it differs from Blender because they are quite different, and understanding those differences can make it a lot easier to transition over from Maya to Blender. So in this lecture I'm just going to explain the UI a little bit, and in future lessons I'll go into more detail for each panel. But one thing to note about Blender that is very different from Maya is you'll notice the window at the top is very barren, and that is because every window and every option within Blender is accessible through this top left panel. So you'll notice on every single one of these, minus the top bar here, you'll notice on every single one of these this button exists, and you can change it to any other layout quite easily. You also have your preset layouts up here. If you click something by accident and your whole window changes, it might have been something here. You can also go through window here as well if you want to like go to your next workspace previous. But anyway, I tend to just leave it in the one mode. The excellent thing about this is its high customizability. So by just pulling from one of the top left, it doesn't really matter what corner, as long as you're pulling from the corner, you'll be able to merge, and then as you can see as I'm dragging over, it's like allowing me to merge those windows back. One thing to note though is you can't merge across if, for example, if this is split, I can't merge this upwards because this is split. I would have to collapse the split to allow me to merge. But gives you a ton of customizability, lets you make your workspace however you want. So that's just kind of how those panels work. Even if you click Shift and tap, you can pull out any window that you want and put it on a second monitor pretty easily. So that's pretty sweet. Just to go through kind of from top left around here, you'll have your 3D viewport, which is your starting window here. These guys could be located at the top or bottom. I know there's, flip to bottom, for example, if yours is down here, if you prefer it at the top. I like it at the top, but, up to you. And then going around here, here's your different modes. I will talk about that in a different one. You have different view settings for a lot of like rendering, viewport rendering can be accessed through here. And then these ones have to do with modeling more specifically, so selecting different types of things about the model, and then there's a lot of just general object commands. One thing about Blender that is very different to Maya, and it's a critical thing to know when using any panel in Blender, is that it's very context sensitive. So what this means is certain menus and options will only show in the correct context, and it may even depend on where your mouse is hovering. Like for example, if I want to bring out this N menu here, I have to be in the 3D viewport, because if I hit N anywhere else, it's not going to show it unless the tab I'm in also has its own type of end menu. The timeline editor doesn't really have much for the context that I'm in, but so if you're not finding something, that could be what it is. It could be the context. Like for example, if I go into edit mode, suddenly my choices change and I get like a ton more options for building, whereas you don't see those in object mode. So that's a critical thing, is all panels can be accessed through this button, and Blender is context sensitive. Those are two critical differences right off the hop. So moving along a little bit, these panels I'll explain more in a different video, but they're just different ways to view your viewport. And then as well, this you can think of this as like the channel box, this end menu here. So there's only, if you want to access the location information, it's just here. I know in Maya there's like there's the attributes and it has like a channel menu. In Blender it's just this one space. So you'll also notice you have scale and dimensions. I'll just explain that really quickly, just because this is another thing that's very different from Blender to Maya. So in Maya, you have your scale of the object, and you just generally have that one channel, but here you have two, and they're giving me two different types of values. So in Blender, think of scale as a percentage. One just means 100%, and if you're bigger than that, 200%. The reason why this matters is because it will change the way certain modifiers behave. That's something else I will talk about in a later lesson. Most importantly, you just need to know that having different scale settings could change the way the object works. Sometimes, if generally, as like a general rule, if it's geometry, you want to have your scale zeroed. So Control A is the apply hotkey, and then you can set it back to 1. So even though it's bigger now, it's still zeroed out. And then a lot of deformer type things, like lattices, for example, and curves, like you wouldn't want to zero them out because you'll actually break their functionality. So that's something I'll explain more later. And then dimensions is like the physical space of this object. So regardless of how big or small you set it, regardless of what this number says, this will be like the true size of your object in world space. So that can be useful to know. And what dictates that as well is your units set in the scene panel, but not getting to that yet. Okay, moving on. That's the 3D viewport. Anything else I'll explain in more detail later. Moving on to your outliner, essentially. So you have a few different options. This is right here. Yeah, so this is just the standard outliner option. This is like one of the many ways to view data. But within the outliner, you have a few different drop-down choices. So typically, I always just use view layer. That's pretty standard way to see things. If you see this scenes option at the top and you notice all your objects and stuff are collapsed, this is going to be a good way just to get like a good idea of how many things are in your scene. Like if you have a really complicated scene, you might want to work from this view, but generally speaking, view layer is a lot easier. You also have most of this, honestly, for production and like general modeling purposes. You can mostly ignore a lot of these. Blender file could be useful if you have like stuff linked in and you want to see the location of where it's coming from. It'll tell you at the bottom here if you have something. You can also view the different types of objects you have in your scene or meshes, etc. One other critical difference between Blender and Maya is the existence of this orphan data panel. So Maya, when you delete something, you just delete it, it's gone. But in Blender, a lot of the time, like connected data it'll hang on to. So like if you put a material on an object and you delete the object, the material is no longer connected to anything, but it's still in the file, and it'll show up in this orphan data area. If you want to get rid of all that extra data, like say for example, you're in a production, you've linked in a character, and you need to delete them out, and you want to link them back in, but it's not working, it's probably because there's still some remaining elements of that character in your scene, so it's not allowing you to like bring it back in because it thinks it's already in your scene. So you would just need to purge it out. If you're also wondering like, I'm deleting this animation loop and it's not actually deleting, I can still see it in my Blender file, you have to purge it out to like fully get rid of it. So it's kind of that second layer of safety in a way of like keeping that extra stuff in your file in case you did need it. A thing to note though is when you close your file and come back in, it basically does an auto purge process for you. So even if you're not paying attention to this panel at all, it'll still clean it up every time you close it. So that's the notable thing about that. And then just in terms of using your outliner, so this is another thing that's quite different from Maya, is we have these collection boxes, which you can think of as groups, but they're not selectable at all. So like if I press A to select everything in the scene, I can't select the collection. It doesn't count as an object. Think of it more as like a tag or like just a visual box to put things in. It's not actually like an object or anything in your scene. If you want to group things under a physical object, what you need to do is create an empty, or I think they're called locators in Maya. I'm not 100% sure. But you would need to do that. It essentially would function the same way, and if you actually export an alembic from Blender to Maya, it will consider the empty a group, so it'll actually translate properly, which is good. So if you do need to export things, consider Maya won't read collection, but it will read nulls. So, or maybe that's what Maya calls it, nulls. Anyway, moving on. If you don't like the way your viewport is, the visibility settings, they give you a lot of choices here. So we've got whether something is selectable or not, and whether or not something is disabled by default in the viewport. So if you need them, that's how you turn them on. You just gotta go open this little drop down and turn them on. So I really like these different options here, and they do fundamentally pretty different things depending on like how you need to get at your objects. So for example, if you disable the touch, obviously I can't select it anymore, and this is including like if I go to select objects, whoopsie, not that. If I do select objects, it still won't select the cube, right? So this can be a thing to remember if you need to like apply a material to something. Like you won't be able to activate that object to link the material if it's not selectable. So that's just something to keep in mind. Of course, hidden, H is also the hotkey. It does the exact same thing. Alt H is to unhide. Just undo that. Same thing as clicking and unclicking. And then we have the, what is it, disable in viewport. So this is different in that unhide will not work. So even if I press H to hide a few other things, and I press Alt H, it will not unhide it. So if you just want to temporarily hide it, you can use H, but if you want to like permanently disable it, you can do that, which is nice. This little check marks is also a way to disable, so if you want to disable a collection. There is a slight difference between these two options because visually they look the same, but this is just disabling it from view, and this is actually unloading it. So if you have a really, really heavy scene and you have a lot of linked objects and you don't need to see the original linked object, you might want to unload them so that it's like a little bit faster to move around in your scene. Again, small files, you won't notice any different whatsoever, but for really big files, that can help with your viewport speed. And then other options down here, if you want, alphabetical sorting. Most of these, honestly, I just leave by default, but if there's something specifically that you're looking for or that you don't want to see, you could enable or disable here. And then these two types I pretty much always ignore. And then the last type, I'm sure you can guess, is whether or not you see it in the render. So that's an independent thing from the viewport. So just keep that. That's another difference too, is like in Maya, if you hide something, it won't render. But in Blender, that's not the case. Whether or not something renders or whether or not you can see it are like two independent traits, which can be quite handy. It's just something to keep in mind when you want to send renders out, because I constantly forget. And then down here, we got the properties panel, generally what's here by default. I'll just go through this real quick, and then we'll wrap up this lesson for going over the UI. So just going in descending order here. These give you more context options. If you don't have anything selected, it won't really look like anything. But you have your main tools on the left here, right, in this menu. So if I select the annotation tool, for example, I'll have it pop up here, which will change, and it'll give you more options and like how you want the behavior to work. So for example, placement 3D cursor, it's going to place it at the depth of my 3D cursor based on like how I'm looking at it. If I change it to view, it's just going to be based on like the perspective camera that I'm in, that view, and it will just like stick to the screen. Can be very handy depending on what you're doing. If you need to if you want to reference something that you drew and you always want to be able to see it, that could be handy. But a really useful one is surface. This is the one I really like. This one. So if you have objects in the way of your surface, they'll just kind of like draw to it. If you just quickly erase, you can get rid of it, and then quickly continue drawing your line. But the only way to access, at least that I've found, maybe there's other hotkeys for it, but the easiest way to access these settings is to have the tool physically selected. Whereas like you could still draw with the D hotkey, for example, and left click and then right click to erase, but I'm not seeing those options when I hold down D, so it's only when I actually go into the tool. Same way for like if you want to find auto merge, for example, which is the option to, if I change this to vertex snapping. I have it currently off, so if I snap to another vert, it's not going to merge, but if I enable this, then it will. So that's, again, there's probably other ways to find it, but that's the easiest way, but you have to be in edit mode. So again, that context sensitive thing is coming up. And then moving on, we have your render settings. So most of these, honestly, as a modeler, you won't care about most of these. One in particular that might interest you is under film, transparent. So if you want to render a transparent background, you have to enable this. It's gray by default for Blender. So if that matters, that's something. This is your scenes. This is where you're going to get like the resolution of your file. So regardless of what my camera is doing, this is another thing that's different from Maya to Blender, is like this is your resolution output, and then your percentage based on that is going to be what you export as. So if you're wondering how big your renders are going to be for your camera, for example, you can see it update in real time as I change these numbers. So this is my film gate right here. And even in this perspective view, I technically have a film gate, but Blender doesn't, I wouldn't really consider this like perspective view as a camera the same way that Maya does. Like if you want to render something, I would just create a physical camera. I wouldn't consider this like viewport camera like a render one. That's more of like a workspace camera. You're not really meant to like render through that view because you don't have these like film gate options enabled by default. So I definitely recommend if you're rendering anything, go through the camera. few different ways to move it around it too, if you wanna move with your camera selected, because you'll notice as you click out of it, you'll just go back into your viewport. Super handy for modeling, but if you're trying to pose your camera, you may want to actually move with it, so then you can do camera to view and then check it off. Just keep in mind that if you have this on and you move it and you want to undo that, you can't. You have to just, Blender can undo very many things, but that is one of the few rare things that you don't really get an undo for, so just be aware of whether or not you have it on. That red border will indicate to you if it's on. And just moving further, cameras, I will explain more in a different lesson. I just kind of wanted to explain the relationship of resolution there and how that works. You can also go by aspect if you want. Your frame rate is right here as well. So if your animations are playing at a bizarre speed, could be that. You have your frame rate options here, which will change, as you can see in my timeline. It is updating. That's just another place to update it. You can also update it in the timeline itself. Up to you. Different options. If for output, where you want your file to go, what file type, etc. It's pretty straightforward. It's all right there. So the default setting is PNG. So if I were to go render image at this time, it would output it as a PNG. And then moving on, render layers. This is more for layer properties, I should say. So this is more for if you're actually a lighter. Modelers don't really care about any of this, I'm going to be honest. So we're just going to skip. And this is your scene. Again, not generally something you ever care about. The only thing that matters is this units, especially in regards to if you are importing something to Maya, because the unit scale needs to be set to 0.01 in order for the scale to translate correctly to Maya. Your unit system does not matter. Regardless of what you set it to, it'll always be the same. What matters is the unit scale. That will actually change how big your objects are in space. And then you'll also need to change your viewport settings accordingly. So for example, right now I see my view, I have my clip start, my end, and my focal length. So this is considered your quote unquote perspective camera that like Maya would have, which is why generally it's considered like a separate camera to like most cameras, because it doesn't take up a space in the outliner, and even though you can access its settings. So clip start can definitely change if your viewport is doing weird, if you've changed your settings and it's not looking right, or for example, a lot of the times if you'll get, this happens more with like really big objects, but you'll get a lot of Z-fighting where you know there isn't any. That could be with your clip start being set too low. If it's like 0.00001 or something, you might get stuff like that. Or if like, you can't see into the distance, I have to like lower it quite a bit. But this is more for like if I set it to 0.01, for example, suddenly my grid disappears and I only have to zoom out a tiny bit and like I already can't see my object. So it's only set to 10 meters though, because that would be the equivalent scale. So you got to set to like 1,000 and now I can see, but then you zoom in close and you're like, object starts to disappear, so you got to set this lower, etc. So yeah, those are dependent on each other. Just keep that in mind. If things are disappearing or your clipping is weird, it's going to be under your view settings in the 3D viewport, because yeah, that perspective camera it only exists in relation to the 3D viewport, so that's where you'll find its settings. And moving on, I only care about that. World, again, this is only for lighters. There is a default world setup. I'm going to skip that. This is your object tab, so anything that's related to object data, like for example viewport visibility, if you want to enable wireframe, if you want to change it to bounds, I don't know, whatever you want, right? There's different, you can change it to wire, there's different uses, like for example, if you want an object as a reference for modeling something else, but you want to be able to see through it, setting it to wire and then unclickable is like a really nice way to do that, because then you have this like custom aid that you've created in your 3D viewport space that you can model around. So I've definitely used that quite a few times. There's definitely good uses for it. If you're wondering why, like if you have textures and they're not showing up in the viewport, it could be because you have it set to solid, not textured mode. So that's just little things to be aware of. And for example, there's other funny settings which could be, okay, so I'm in object mode. Oh yeah, right, I disabled the click. Okay, click that. If you have in front enabled, like for example, no matter what's behind it, it'll always, like even if it is in front, it'll always show it that way. So this is particularly helpful for like rigs, for bones, stuff like that. It's handy if you need that. It's an option. We're going to ignore those. That's not really stuff you would use. And then we have the modifier panel. Not going to explain that at all right now. That'll be a different lesson because that's a whole thing. Moving on. This is particles. If you just press plus, you can create one. Not what I'm going to talk about right now. That's also a whole thing. Skipping that. Physics. Not talking about that. Skipping it. Object constraints. Not talking about that. Skipping it. And we got mesh data down here. So anything that's relevant for like the in edit mode qualities of the object, like for example your UV maps, your shape keys, or your vertex groups, are all located in this one spot, which is very nice. And then yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about that, because each of these things could be a more in-depth lecture at another time. And then we have the material tab. So again, your material view will kind of be based, it's always set to material by default, so you should be able to see it. But like for example, if I have this basic material and I want to see it in the viewport, by default it's always white. But if I change the color, then I can see it. So if you have multiple objects, you want to make another material, make it a different color, you know, whatever you want to do. For viewport settings, if you have it set to object, like I said, now that it's being controlled by the material, I won't see it. But there is also a separate way to color objects in viewport display under the object panel color. So for example, if you have geometry that's like a sculpt geometry, or it's like proxy geometry, that's a good use for that, because then you can have a separate thing for your materials for blocking, and then you have another way to set like your dummy geometry or whatever. So Blender just gives you a bunch of different choices to do the same thing. Whichever your preference is kind of whatever works for you, but it gives you a bunch of different options for however you want to go about it. So that's material tab. Again, not really going to go into this too much right now. That's a whole deal. And then this tab is texture properties. I literally have never used this tab in my life. I'm sure it's more relevant for like surfacing and stuff like that. So moving further down out of the properties panel here, you'll notice I have information. If you right click, you can see scene statistics. By default, this is usually off, which I don't understand, but you definitely want scene statistics as a modeler, because that'll tell you your counts. So for example, it will show you everything in your viewport visible at a time. So I have 14 verts. If I hide one cube, it'll show 7. But if it'll prioritize edit mode over object mode. So if I'm in object mode, it'll show me everything in object mode. If I'm in edit mode, it's only going to show me what's in edit mode, so the numbers will change. So just be aware of that when you're checking your values, so that you're aware of the mode that you're in, that you're looking at. And it will tell you your objects, and yeah, a lot of different useful stuff down there, which is off by default, so I don't know why, but it is. And then we have the timeline down here. This is, personally, I like to keep it open just because I do tend to use the timeline with modeling at times, and I will show that in a separate lesson about how I go about doing that. But yeah, pretty straightforward. Which this correlates to your time slider, which you can also just move by moving it around. Your start, your end, very straightforward. And I'm not going to talk about keying or anything right now because that's a separate thing. And then just because I did skim over the 3D viewport real fast at the start, let's just go into that a little bit more with the remaining time here. So tools on the left, those are pretty straightforward. One thing to note is that this tool in particular, this selection mode, if you hit W, you'll cycle between them. And what I noticed is if you're on a different one, it'll change your hotkeys a little bit. They function a bit differently. I haven't really figured out the purpose of this. Personally, I don't really like it. I just leave it to the standard mode, and then all the tools operate the way I expect them to. But if you are like trying to circle select or something and it's like not letting you, or it's being weird about it, just make sure to check this and just see what it's on. You can disable it if you want, which is fine. But anyway, just something to be aware of that I've noticed. And then honestly, most of these settings you won't ever click on because the hotkeys for them are really good. So the only one, like I said, is maybe annotate if you want to change the type of mode it's on, but otherwise I'm pretty much just always in this mode. If I ever want to move something, it's just G. And then if you want to lock to an axis, it's G, X, or Y, or Z, depends what your axis is. GY, G is for moving, grabbing, You can think that. R is for rotating, and S is for scale, so it's very easy to remember. And like I said, if you want to lock to a specific axis, just get used to seeing these axes. Actually, sorry, another tool I'll enable all the time. Even though I won't use it, I'll enable it just so I can see the arrows. If you don't like the arrows, you can disable them with Control tilde. Kind of, you'll see this little box. So if you don't see your arrows and you don't know why, there's two reasons why that could be happening. It's either this box is disabled, in which case those tools are disabled from view, or you have it set to 3D cursor and your 3D cursor is like way out there and you're like, where's my arrows? I don't know why I don't have my arrows. My box is on and I don't see my arrows. So that's another reason why I like using this tool, is because sometimes you'll have stuff selected and you don't realize it's selected, and then if you don't see your arrow, you're like, wait, I should see it, and then you zoom out and you realize you have something extra selected. So that has saved me enough times that I think it's always worth having it on. And then it's also just a good visual representation of like where your axes are. So it's like, I want to move it to the right, then I see the green arrow, so it's Y. And as long as, once you get used to it, then it's quite quick to go through those hotkeys, and then you should never have to actually press these arrows. Obviously you can if you want, but I've gotten into the habit of never ever using them. I just like to have them as a visual aid so I know what orientation I'm in. It also helps for visually seeing your orientation. So you have the different modes here, which are also changeable from here. But if you're, for example, if my local view is different than the global view, then the arrows will change, and I can just see which view I'm in, and it's just like a visual reminder, so that you don't have to actually click the button and look and see what, or like look up here to see what you're in. You'll just know based on the orientation of your arrows. So that's another good thing to keep in mind. You have some like measuring tools and stuff down here if you want to use them, but honestly, generally I'm just always on here, and with the rotation and select tools being like so accessible with the hotkey, I never, again, you can if you want, it's the same, but I never bother. So that is that. Let's just go over here real quick. So the end menu that I was talking about at the start, you've got your transform data here. That's pretty self-explanatory. If you have like properties on a rig or something, they'll probably show up in this area. If you have a specific tool selected, this is where all those tool settings will be. So like if you're in sculpt mode, for example, all your different tool settings for your sculpting will be here. Again, I'm going to talk about that a different time. That's a whole deal. But and then underneath we have views, so these are all your viewport settings, including the settings for the 3D cursor. So if you want to know exactly where this is located, you have that information right here, and you can copy paste that information, because it's using, think of this as like the dimensions for the cube, where it's like in relation to full scene scale. So you can't like, your 3D cursor isn't like an object that you can zero, like it's always going to be the same values no matter what. So that's something to keep in mind. And those don't really matter. If you have annotations, like I was talking about before, if you have something, you can make them different colors if you want. You know, you got your options down here, different choices. They will be based on the frame that they're on too, like they can be animated. So that's just something to be aware of. And yeah, that should be enough to get started in terms of the UI for Blender, and more lessons on the way, and have a good day, folks. Bye everybody.